Released in 2024 and written and directed by Robert Eggers, Nosferatu is a remake of the 1922 film of the same name by F.W. Murnau, and it's the second remake of said film, with the first being Werner Herzog's 1979 film Nosferatu the Vampire. With the original Nosferatu being an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula that narrowly survived after Murnau underwent a lawsuit filed by Stoker's widow, both remakes of it are also unofficial adaptations of the horror classic by extension. Eggers' remake of Nosferatu was not only my most anticipated film of 2024, but it was also a project of his that I was very much looking forward to with great interest. Considering his rather solid track record from The Witch to The Lighthouse to The Northman, I was very much compelled to see what he would do with his own iteration of one of the most iconic works of horror cinema in existence. And so after months of waiting, and after finally seeing it when it came out in theaters right after the holiday season, Nosferatu 2024 was everything I expected it to be as a work of gothic horror and more. So much so that I went to see it again at the start of 2025, and I found myself loving it even more. And it's at a point now where, after having watched the extended cut on Blu-ray, the film may even go down as one of my favorite films out there. But alas, some elaboration may be needed on my part. So, no sense beating around the bush here. Let's sink our teeth in and see what it is that keeps the narrative blood in Nosferatu 2024 pumping and flowing. The basic gist of the plot in Nosferatu 2024 is that we have this young woman named Ellen Hutter, played by Lily Rose Depp, who, once upon a time, telepathically called out for a spirit of comfort of any celestial sphere. And she did make contact with one such being, but it was a rather malevolent one, an ancient vampire named Count Orlok, played by Bill Skarsgård, and she has held that trauma of meeting him in ever since. Years later, she fell in love with and married Thomas Hutter, played by Nicholas Hoult, who has acquired a position as a real estate proprietor and is sent by his firm to Transylvania to sell property in Risberg to Orlok. Thomas completes the transaction, only to realize that he has unknowingly not only given the vampire Count permission to move to his hometown, but also unwittingly signed his wife away to the monster himself. And so, once Orlok arrives, Risberg descends into plague-ridden chaos, and everyone whom Ellen holds dear start to be wrapped up in the untold horrors that the Count brings about. This prompts Ellen to confront the very thing that has haunted her for many years and make the ultimate sacrifice in order to overcome him and rid her world of his evil. Nosferatu is rather rich in thematics to pull from. Thematics that are strongly bolstered and supported by the film's narrative, with the most prominent being about how one deals with evil or darkness within themselves. Ellen tries to deny her darker temptations for Orlok, only to realize that she has to confront them in order to defeat the Count, even when his will is as strong as it is, considering that he was the first person in her life who gave her some form of comfort, as twisted as it truly was. The scene where Ellen and Orlok meet in an astral plane much later into the story showcases how the former is still susceptible to lust for the latter, yet she resists, thus prompting the Count to threaten her with his 3-night warning, while the film's climax where Ellen offers herself to Orlok is shown to be her confronting those temptations in order to defeat them, even at the cost of her own life. Thomas lets the temptation of monetary gain as a means to create a foundation for him and his wife to have a much happier life down the line, push him into fulfilling Orlok's request to move to Risberg without properly questioning or realizing the darker implications, or properly heeding the warnings of the locals until it's far too late. It's only when Thomas is saved by members of a nearby monastery does he realize the full extent of what Orlok intends to do at Risberg, and he returns home with a vow to undo what he did by hunting and killing the Count himself. Friedrich Harding remains in denial of what is truly happening around him, even going as far as to shun away everyone who tries to reason with him, from Sievers and von Franz to Ellen, and that costs him everything he loves as well as his own life. The darkness within him, in this case, would be his willful ignorance. And all that brings us to Count Orlok, a harbinger of evil himself, an embodiment of darkness and its influence over all who are susceptible to its will. Due to centuries of being a lone undead fiend, his temptation for Ellen drives him to spread suffering and death, not just to those closest to her and those who could potentially stand in his way, but to all of Whisburg. However, it's this temptation that also becomes the death of him by the end of the story. There's also thematics related to how melancholy or depression can affect a subject and those around them. Ellen considers Orlok to be her shame because of how it was her melancholy causing her to be alienated by her family that prompted her to try to soothe her emotional pain. For a long time, she has had to deal with this shame, but then she met Thomas Hutter and she found happiness and solace. However, the nightmares of Orlok and his coming for her start to return, and she now has to confront them in order to overcome her shame, which has haunted her for years and now threatens to tear her away from all she holds dear. Thomas and von Franz are among the only individuals, at least the ones that we see in this film, who try to work with Ellen through her shame. While von Franz knows right away of what truly ails her, it's not until much late into the story where Ellen finally confides to her husband about how the vampiric count which tried to kill him is also her long prevalent shame. Both Thomas and von Franz serve as examples of how one must address a loved one's case of melancholy, with understanding, delicacy, love. On the other hand, we have Friedrich, who alienates Ellen, remains in disbelief and denial of what ails her, and even goes on to have her treated in detached and even cruel ways, like having her tied to a bed and demanding her to leave. Meanwhile, Friedrich's wife, Anna, tries to understand what ails Ellen, but fails to comprehend the nature of it, and Sievers, while still doing the best that he can as a doctor, resorted to clinical methods which don't really do much to properly address the issue with Ellen's condition, such as drugging her so that she would be restless throughout nighttime. And then there's Orlok, who is Ellen's shame in its darkest and most sinister physical manifestation, representing the worst effects that melancholy could have on those who suffer from it. So while the thematics in Nosferatu 2024 make for a compelling narrative that bolsters them in a logically coherent manner, there's another key element which makes the story as strong as it is.
Where you go?
The characters are very well realized and serve as the lifeblood for the story's beating heart, coming off as real, believable people who all find themselves thrusted into a nightmare come true. A nightmare that is facilitated by an insidious count whose desire for our lead knows no bounds. For starters, let's talk about good old Thomas. Thomas Hutter serves as the audience surrogate for the first third of the movie, where he embarks on a journey to close a deal with Orlok in Transylvania, to sell a derelict property in Whisburg to the Count himself. Thomas's love for Ellen and wanting the best life for her is what ultimately causes him to power through closing the deal with Orlok for him to move to Whisburg. Unfortunately, the sack of gold offered to him, and his fear of the Count, the latter of which being very evident since his very first night in the castle, is what causes Thomas to unknowingly permit Orlok to make his move on to Ellen. Upon realizing this, after Orlok has effectively moved out, Thomas narrowly escapes the castle, is taken in by a monastery to recover, and desperately makes his way back to Whisburg, arriving just in time, exhausted yet finding himself in Ellen's arms again, only for Orlok and his plague to have arrived at the same time as him. Thomas desperately seeks to protect Ellen from then on, and despite her admittance of her connection with Orlok and an argument over how he unwittingly signed her off to the Count for a future with her that will never come to be at this point, Thomas is driven to hunt and kill Orlok in order to free his beloved. However, Thomas finds himself in a false hunt planned by von Franz and Ellen, so that she could destroy Orlok in a way where no one else but her would have to die, due to von Franz's concerns that iron stakes may not even be enough to defeat a beast as powerful as Orlok. Thomas then reunites with Ellen one last time before she passes, and he mourns over his beloved who gave her life to protect his. Thomas serves as a great romantic foil for Ellen, and Nicholas Hoult does an excellent job portraying this character throughout the film, especially when he's at Orlok's castle, where he has to portray the characters being constantly on edge, nervous, and eventually terrified beyond words just by the mere presence of Orlok, as well as when the vampiric Count begins to approach him for his blood. Not only that, but his chemistry with Lily Rose Depp is incredible, where one could buy them as a loving, committed couple, and Holt especially does very well in conveying Thomas's desperation in saving Ellen and his grief over his wife's noble sacrifice. For our second exhibit, let's go into Professor Albin Eberhard von Franz, who is essentially the Van Helsing analog for Nosferatu. In this film, von Franz was laughed out of a university in Switzerland and moved to Visburg due to his beliefs and practices regarding the occult. Despite his eccentricities, the professor stands as the primary voice of reason and bearer of knowledge regarding the supernatural elements at play in the story. He's also the quickest in understanding Ellen's condition and deducing the supernatural nature of it all, hence why Ellen is able to confide to him about the evil which haunts her. Von Franz not only understands right away that the plague which overwhelms Visburg is the work of Count Orlok, the Nosferatu, but he also uncovers the Solomonari Codex, which holds the answers which he seeks for how to kill Orlok. While his methods are considered unorthodox and even morally gray by the end when considering that he has to draw Thomas away from his wife, von Franz still expresses grief over how it had to come to Ellen giving her own life to defeat Orlok. Yet all of it was for the greater good in order to ensure brighter days ahead. Being a cat person himself, as established since his introductory scene, he even goes on to carry Greta, Ellen's cat, to comfort her as a new day dawns over what has transpired. Willem Dafoe, as one would expect from him, turns out a great performance for a pretty solid character, and this is arguably one of his more subdued roles, at least as of recent years. Next up, we have Friedrich Harding, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. Friedrich is just a downright tragic character, let me just say. He stands as a man who refuses to accept the extraordinary and remains standoffish when von Franz pleads for him to believe in Ellen's unnatural behavior. He tries his best to keep everything together, yet fails to comprehend what is truly at stake. Despite his personal bias against Ellen, Friedrich shuns the warnings from those around him, not out of malicious intent, but out of a means to protect his family, consisting of his wife Anna, their 2 daughters, and their 3rd unborn child. As a result, however, he loses everything all in one night, despite his promises that he would be there to protect his girls from any monsters that were to come to their room. Orlok, the very monster which Friedrich has denied the existence of, would go on to keep him asleep for when the Count slaughters his family. Friedrich goes on to lash out and blame Ellen for the plague that's ravaging Visburg and for his family dying, stating that her very presence does him wrong. He then starts to succumb to the plague himself and spends the last moments of his life in the crypt with his family, where he goes on to make love with his wife's corpse right before he dies. Right afterwards, his body, along with the rest of the family crypt, is set ablaze by von Franz, Thomas, and Sievers for cleansing. It is a truly tragic end for this character, a man who is ultimately yet another victim to dark forces beyond his comprehension. Friedrich and his family are all victims of circumstance, and in the most tragic way possible, all because of their association with Ellen. With Friedrich being the patriarch who vows to protect his family and care about them and love them at any cost, only to fail to essentially be there for them when they need him most. And as far as Aaron Taylor Johnson's portrayal is concerned, he is downright excellent, proving that he absolutely can act when given direction and material that can bring out the very best in his prowess. Then we have the title monster himself, the Nosferatu, Count Orlok. Orlok is presented in this film as classic of an interpretation of a vampire as one can get. As stated by some nuns who speak with Thomas, Orlok was a nobleman who made a deal with a demon called Solomonar, which turned him into an undead fiend, a harbinger of plague and death, a Nosferatu. For centuries he remained dormant in eternal darkness until Ellen's cry for comfort awakened him, and has since longed to be sated by her. From then on, he orchestrates events to where he would be able to move to Visburg and to finally make his move onto Ellen. Bill Skarsgård turns in what may very well be the performance of his career. He is absolutely incredible as this character. There's so much to say about how Orlok was presented that is worthy of praise, from the way he's physically realized by all the pounds of makeup and prosthetics which allow for Skarsgård to physically transform into a different person entirely, to the way he speaks, which gives the character a presence and demeanor, which not only defines him as a long undead being, such as in the way he wheezes before and after speaking, slowly, as if he has to exert effort and even endure some level of pain in trying to breathe due to his body's state of decay, but also said presence allows him to command the screen and hold the audience's attention. To say that Skarsgård is unrecognizable as Count Orlok would be an understatement, and he is so in the best way imaginable. He shows his full commitment to the craft by belting out a powerhouse performance as a cold, dark, monstrous figure whose lust for Ellen drives him to commit unspeakable evil without remorse or relent. Orlok not only demonstrates great power, such as when he single-handedly brings about a plague to Visburg via a ship filled with plague rats, and can telepathically influence his victims at will to fall into certain trance-like states, but when he threatens to rend Ellen's world asunder should he refuse to repledge her vows to him by the third night, he is, for the lack of a better term, a man of his word. When he harms Anna with a pack of rats on the first night and then kills her and her children on the second. Orlok is a monster through and through, yet there is still a shred of humanity in him, not just represented by his eyes, when he's awake that is, and his garments which he would have donned back when he was a mortal man, but also in a moment where his slow death-like wheezing becomes faster breathing when he is united with Ellen on that fateful third night, as he finally gets the night of passion which he longed and desired from her, only for that passion to be his undoing when the first crow of cock dawns. All this and more makes this interpretation of Count Orlok not only a great villain, but also one of the best iterations of Count Dracula out there, considering that Orlok is basically Dracula, just with a different name.
I don't think I've ever found a mustache threatening at all. It's not intimidating.
Tell that to Hitler.
Already.
Yeah, that sums it up quite well. Or also, actually, no, let me give a different comparison. Tell that to Vlad the Impaler, the guy who inspired Dracula.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah,
Stalin.
him too. Stalin, yeah.
And finally, we are brought to essentially the main character of the story, Ellen Hutter. Ellen is a tragic heroine through and through. She was ostracized by her family due to her psychic connection, as well as by her mother passing during her youth, for which her father held some resentment towards her. Her melancholy, which was what depression is referred to back in the 19th century, which spurred from her ostracization, and her ability to telepathically know of things before they happen, like what her Christmas presents would be ahead of when she's supposed to know, only exacerbated her becoming more of an outcast from her family. And so, with all this grief, Ellen sought out comfort one night from any being out there that could hear her cries and wipe away her tears. On that fateful night, when she telepathically reached out for a guardian angel, a spirit of comfort, a spirit of any celestial sphere, anything, Orlok answered her call. For a moment, after swearing that she would be his for eternity, Ellen did find some comfort, only to realize that she swore herself to a fiendish ghoul. From then on, she considers Orlok to be her shame, something which she tries to suppress out of fear of being alienated by those whom she cares about, especially Thomas, whom she fears for when he announces his departure to Transylvania. And this fear comes from the fact that Thomas may not even be able to understand what she's saying, because, granted, why would she even expect anybody to believe her that she made a vow to a vampire at one point? Like, it would just be too crazy to be believable, especially coming from her. Ellen then has to admit to Thomas about her dreams of her marrying death itself and being happy about it, despite seeing everyone in her life all dead around her, albeit without explicitly stating that death is Count Orlok. Thomas even tries to tell her that her doctors advised against discussing such terrible fantasies, yet she insists because what she needs is for someone to listen and understand her troubles. While Thomas is away and as Orlok's plan comes to fruition, Ellen goes on to have violent seizure-like fits as the vampire steadily approaches, as destiny calls to her for the inevitability of what is coming. Once the Count himself arrives, Ellen and Orlok have a confrontation in their psychic realm. She deems him as being akin to a serpent slithering inside her, while he states that her desire for comfort is what brought them together. She was the one who called to him. Even when Ellen tries to deny whatever shred of desire she has for him, Orlok calls her out and then threatens her with the deaths of everything and everyone around her. Despite all of her warnings, she is shunned by Friedrich after Anna is attacked by rats and she is forced to return home with Thomas. That night, Ellen goes on to tell Thomas the truth about why Orlok is after her in particular, and that the Count is her shame, the thing that indelibly shaped her into the woman whom she is at this point. Which then spirals into her berating him for failing to write to her and for having his excursion to Transylvania result in him signing her away to the Count for a sack of gold. All the promises he made to her of a better life after his trip were all for naught, with no money, no career in Knox firm, only death at their doorstep. Ellen even goes on to goad Thomas by stating how he could never satisfy her the way Orlok could, resulting in Thomas succumbing to the desire to try to prove that claim is false. Now, of course, this is all during one of Ellen's fits, which have been tied to Orlok's influence on her, so despite the foundation for this behavior, Ellen still shows a great deal of remorse, and even deems herself as ashamed and unclean. And it is Thomas's unwavering love that is what pulls her out of the break. As the House of Harding falls, Ellen and von Franz discuss how only she can save them all by giving herself to Orlok. Ellen declares herself as having no ill, which is to indicate that the tragic events of the night before and her love for Thomas, which is now stronger than ever thanks to the truth of her connection to Orlok coming to light, have fully emboldened her into making the ultimate sacrifice by giving herself over to the vampire himself, not out of a dark temptation for him, but out of an altruistic necessity to destroy him before he could do more harm. However, while she has seen Orlok as a harbinger of death, in a turn of fate, she also goes on to be the harbinger of his own, as she dons a white bridal gown, calling all the way back to the dream she had where she was marrying death. Ellen gives herself to Orlok, but only so that his desire for her is what would keep him in a trap by sunrise. And after killing Orlok and in her final moments, she gets some level of solace by being able to see Thomas one last time before she passes, and is laden with lilacs by von Franz in memoriam of her sacrifice. Ellen Hutter is an excellent protagonist, a young woman who has been tormented her whole life by her melancholy and her ties to Orlok, who, despite everything, shows the strength necessary to confront the darkness which tempts her and break the curse of Nosferatu. The character bears so many layers of depth that are expertly portrayed through her emotions, her connections to the two most prominent men in her life, and the tidbits of her backstory which inform why she is the way she is. And Lily Rose Depp absolutely knocks this role out of the park. The role demands a lot from her as an actress, both physically and mentally, and she rises up to the occasion and makes her performance one that should be for the history books. She can go from calm, yet in a state of shame, to angry and exploding with despair, to having a horrific episode akin to a seizure, to submissive and pleading for forgiveness, to cold, to aroused, and all the way back around to being ashamed again, all in one scene. And this is just one example of Depp's incredible acting prowess throughout this film, which is to say that she goes through the ringer in terms of displaying the physicality of her character, undergoing several sequences that are akin to what one would see out of The Exorcist. So in short, and maybe put things mildly, Ellen Hutter, pretty good character. As far as the other characters go, Anna Harding and the children whom she's had with Friedrich add to the tragic dynamic of the latter, being his loving wife and kids who all end up becoming victims of Orlok's evil, as well as serving as unfortunate witnesses to the drama surrounding Ellen's unnatural behavior. Anna serves as a well-meaning anchor for both Ellen and Friedrich, only for that to end up costing her both her children's lives and her own. William Sievers serves as a head doctor in Whisburg, who is also in denial of the supernatural will of Orlok, being what is ailing Ellen, and being what Herdnock is alluding to, though he's quicker to catch on to the scope of it all, especially once Orlok brings a plague with him and into town. Due to being an apprentice to von Franz, Sievers turns to him for counsel and for assistance on the matter of Ellen. Once Whisburg is put under quarantine, Sievers becomes fully committed to helping von Franz and eventually Thomas in destroying the very cause of the plague itself. Then we have Herdnock, Thomas's boss and Orlok's emissary, as well as this film's equivalent to Renfield. Nock is essentially the one who helps Orlok in facilitating his move from afar, by promising Thomas a position at his firm, once he completes the transaction for Orlok's move to Whisburg. Once the deed is done, Nock is then discovered by locals to be an absolute bloodthirsty maniac, and is sent to an asylum under the management of Dr. Sievers. He goes on to be one of the heralds of Orlok's coming, though unlike Ellen, he's much more lucid, and he goes on to be subservient and willing to do anything for his cruel master, which even includes dying for him by the end. While these characters don't get quite as much focus or depth as the ones that we covered in the previous section, they still serve as great foils for those more prominent developed members of the cast. The film also features some rather compelling parallels amongst its cast of characters to one another. For example, von Franz secretly plans with Ellen for her to give her life in order to defeat Orlok, and part of the plan is to divert Thomas and Sievers into a false hunt for the Count so that Ellen can do her work. This is all due to the professor's concerns of their iron stakes alone not being enough to defeat Orlok because of how powerful he's already demonstrated to be. However, despite not realizing Ellen's role in von Franz's plan, Orlok has Herdnock sacrificing himself by taking his place in his coffin when Thomas and company go to Grunwald to drive a stake in the Count's heart. Nock gives his life to buy Orlok time to go to Ellen, and Ellen gives her own to destroy Orlok. Orlok plots a diversion to have Nock sacrifice himself to keep Thomas and company from being able to kill the Count in time, and von Franz leads his team away from Ellen and on a false hunt so that their best chance at killing Orlok can come to fruition. Another example would be how Ellen kisses Thomas in contrast to how she does Orlok. Taking her height into consideration, for Thomas, she stands on her tippy toes in order to be at enough of a level to reach for a kiss, and she does so willingly, for he is the man whom she loves most. On the other hand, Ellen, despite her connection to him, doesn't love Orlok the same, so she doesn't kiss him for the passion that she does for Thomas, which means the Count has to bring her up to his level so that he can kiss her. There's also some similarities between Friedrich's behavior towards Ellen and her father's treatment towards her in the past, where Friedrich is alienating towards her when she displays signs of her connection to ethereal forces. It's even more apparent when, in a fit of grief and anger, he blames Ellen for the deaths of Anna and their children, similarly to how Ellen's own father blamed her for her mother's death. And of course, the most prominent parallel is how Orlok and Ellen were both the death of one another, as well as the matter of how they each brought about their death. While most of the killings which Orlok commits are cruel and violent, he slowly and passionately drinks out of Ellen to where there's even a slight sense of arousal from her when he sinks his teeth into her. And it's not all that dissimilar to when Orlok drinks out of Thomas, though in that case the latter wasn't as lucid and the blood-sucking was for Orlok to gain sustenance and nothing more. And at the end of the story, when the sun rises, while Orlok is bleeding profusely and letting out one final scream before he dies, Ellen, after showing him the sun, holds him as if she's trying to comfort him into a long, deep sleep before she dies. All these parallels really bring quite the amount of depth to the story and really hit home just how much thought Robert Eggers put into his script in order to use the original Nosferatu as inspiration and really develop the foundation to flesh out the characters in his version even more than what we got in the original or even Herzog's version.
Aaron Taylor Johnson's character Frederick will end up losing his entire family, his kids, and then his wife. They'll all...
Yeah, nothing happens in the last 45 minutes. It's a character losing his entire family.
And then he died from the plague. Yeah, exactly. Nothing happens other than that.
You geriatric Jimmy Neutron.
Stop disrespecting Jimmy Neutron like that.
Nosferatu 2024 is also a technical marvel to behold. Eggers and company bring a modern spin to how F.W. Murnau's classic was crafted, while still retaining the German expressionist element of visual storytelling. For example, the film retains shots of Orlok's shadow ascending to Ellen's bedroom, not just as a callback to the original, but also to retain the darker meaning behind such a creepy visual, in that Orlok is the shadow of death consuming all that surrounds Ellen with the intent to have her all to himself. The analogy of Orlok being the shadow of death is also very much present in shots such as one where the shadow of Orlok's hand stretches and travels across Ritzburg, descending upon where Ellen and Thomas reside, running parallel to and symbolizing his plague overwhelming the town and his power and influence over it all, being used as a means to bring Ellen closer to submitting to him once more. The film is also beautifully shot, with gorgeous landscapes being very well captured like the fields of Ritzburg, the open seas, and the Carpathian mountainside. The town of Ritzburg itself is also well realized, both in its period authentic set design and with various moody shots of the town at night, from Nock rowing Orlok's coffin down the stream to Schloss Grunwald, to Thomas von Franz and Sievers rowing down that same stream during their hunt for the Count. Not to mention, the film does the mythology of vampires justice, through how it presents Orlok as not just an absolutely horrifying beast of the night, but an ethereal evil whose influence is felt well before he even sets foot on Ritzburg. For example, the segments where we focus on Thomas in Orlok's castle are just oozing with mood, from how Orlok is shot in certain moments, like how the camera keeps him blurry and in the shadows in order to make him appear more ominous and unnatural, and the sense of dread and eventual terror from how powerless Thomas is while at the Count's mercy. The film also illustrates how nightmare-like it is to be in Orlok's presence, not only with how Orlok seems to move, almost floating out of a shot from one side of the screen, and then suddenly reappearing right next to Thomas with a chalice and some wine on the other side of the screen, but also with how Thomas suddenly finds himself moved from the dining table to the fireplace, and even hallucinates a statue turning towards him as Orlok begins to approach him to drink his blood. There's also the notion of how, even when there's a slight arousal from one's blood being drunk by Orlok in this film, the visual of how Orlok drinks said blood is anything but arousing, considering how grotesque it both looks and sounds. All of these technical aspects, the cinematography, the set design, the lighting and use of shadows, they all come together to add to the horrors which Count Orlok inflicts, such as when he stalks and kills one of the last surviving sailors during his ship ride to Ritzburg, where he subtly hides in the lower deck as the sailor walks right past him in his hunt for him. And the film certainly doesn't skimp out on having disturbing or nightmarish imagery, like quick shots of blood leaking out of Ellen's face as a result of her dark connection with Orlok, and some downright horrific sequences such as when Anna witnesses the Count murder her daughters in the dead of night right in front of her, with his silhouette standing out against the cold blue backdrop of the moonlit night. These scenes are just a few out of many in Nosferatu, where the horror is made all the more effective through the expert craftsmanship that is on display throughout its runtime. And how can I forget the excellent musical score composed by Robert Carolan? The music really adds to both the horror and dread of Nosferatu and the tragedy of Ellen Hutter and her ill-fated connection with Orlok, right down to how the opening track of the film, titled Once Upon a Time, also bookends the film, encapsulating how the story both begins and ends with Ellen and Orlok together, fated for each other. Honestly, what else can I even say here? Nosferatu 2024 is an absolute masterpiece that takes the classic story of the original film as well as Bram Stoker's novel and injects new life into bringing about the potential that can be found in the best of Gothic storytelling. Robert Eggers, the cast, cinematographer, makeup artists, composers, set designers, costume designers, everyone involved with the making of this film have all done wonders with it, and should be proud of what they were able to accomplish here. The more I think and talk about this film, the more I love it. and I would go as far as to call it one of the best remakes of all time, due to the sheer respect it has for its predecessors, while also bringing a new, more nuanced angle in the story. And to see that angle be executed as well as it is here just makes this film even more impressive. To put it simply, Nosferatu 2024 is a really great film and a favorite of mine, and I absolutely, positively recommend it. But in all seriousness, it's just Twilight for the film fanatics when it's all said and done.
It's Twilight for the film fanatic.
Ah! He did it!
Wow.
He did it!
He brought out
Holy
Twilight.
crap! Holy crap!
Hey, you guys know I was gonna pull that card. Wink, wink. So that just about does it for this essay video of mine on Nosferatu 2024. I would like to thank you all very much for watching, and I hope you all found this video to be worth your while. If this video fancied you, feel free to check out more of my content, essay videos or live streams, and follow me here for any updates regarding what may come. Whatever project I have coming up could range from being Godzilla related, Universal Monsters related, or related to something else. Who can even say at this point? Regardless, I'll be sure to signpost what the next project will be when it's on the way. But until then, once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you all later. Happy Halloween.
I love to have disagreements. I would love an echo chamber.